So today begins the process of taking down my transmission and swapping out my old clutch for a brand new one. So you can see I've got plenty of cardboard underneath the vehicle as always. That's for any spills that I might encounter. And you can probably notice that my truck is already raised up. As you can see, I've got the front wheels on ramps. This is just to give me enough access to get under there and drain the fluid from the transmission and probably undo the drive shaft. When it comes to actually removing the transmission from there, you want the vehicle to be as high as possible off the ground so you actually have room to move the transmission out from under it. Theoretically, if your only goal is to switch out the clutch, you could move it back there and do the clutch and pop it back in and never have to actually take it out from under the truck, but it's just a lot more comfortable to work without it being in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and get a drain pan, same one you'd use for an oil change, and undo the drain bolt on the transmission so that I can drop all that fluid out. So here we are underneath the Tacoma. You see my drive shaft right there, and that is the transmission, right? You see the bell housing over here. Back toward this section, you should see the drain bolt. So if you come over here, that is right there. This is the drain bolt. You take this off, transmission fluid will drain out. I almost feel like it could stand to be a little tall, like higher up the front of the truck to make it a little more comfortable to work. I may do that, but for just draining it, I think I'm fine. So I'm gonna slide a pan up under here and just undo that bolt and let this thing drain out. Then you have to get the center bearing over there. There's just two bolts, one on either side. You take that off of the drive shaft, you can pull the drive shaft out. When you do that, you need a pan underneath here so that you can catch the fluid that's going to drain out of the tail shaft of the transmission, and then all the fluid is gone and you're pretty much ready to start taking it down. Got this under. Now I'm going to go ahead and open the garage door because if you've never smelled it before, transmission fluid is like the armpit of a car kind of smell. It's absolutely disgusting and I can't imagine that it's good for you, so I'm going to get as much circulation in this garage as I possibly can before I let that stuff out. Alright, the garage door is open now and you're going to want to go ahead and bring out your big sockets for this. The drain bolt for the transmission on the Tacoma is a 24mm. So I've got that set up here on my breaker bar. I'm just going to let it loose using this and then I'll turn it the rest of the way by hand. Alright. Make sure my drain pan plug has been removed, and here comes a bath of the stinkiest fluid I've ever experienced. Oh yeah, that looks terrible. Actually, not that bad as far as the oil goes, although the color is just not very nice. It's definitely time for a replacement, yeah? Let's get that out of there. Well, that does its thing. I'll clean up this bolt with a rag and put it somewhere safe. Some of these drain bolts are magnetic from the factory. I'm not sure that the Tacoma one is. However, you do see that there's a good amount of filth accumulated in here even after I wiped it down. So I'll just go ahead and basically clean off that inside stuff so I don't have that old sludge up in the transmission when I go and put in the new fluid. Overall, my fluid looked pretty decent as far as like its appearance. It hadn't broken down. It was just pretty much black, but it was still nice and, you know, viscous and looked appropriate. So it's about time to change it, but it wasn't exactly, you know, letting my transmission grind itself to death either. Look at that. That's a lot of filth. I don't see any shavings or anything though. It's just mostly like crud. So it's pretty good. The transmission's almost drained, so once this is clean, I'll go ahead and replace this back on the transmission so I don't lose it. One thing that I noticed was I could not find the torque value on my Haynes manual for this particular bolt. I think last time I just tightened it down, and to be honest with you, as long as it's nice and snug, it shouldn't leak anything. I saw that amusingly the Haynes manual does have a torque spec for the automatic transmission drain bolt that's 20 foot-pounds, so that's actually what I'm going to do with this right now. And if that doesn't feel like it's secure enough, then I might just tighten it a little bit more by hand. Got my torque wrench in hand. I should take a rag and just wipe off that little excess drip from the edge of that. This is exactly what I will do. Get some of that out of there. This is always like an exercise in speed. Alright, there's the drain bolt. Oh well. Keeps your drain bolt threads nice and lubricated. Alright, I've got it on hand tight, finger tight. Give it a little final wipe on the outside just to keep it clean. I don't like oily, messy interfaces. They're my vehicles and nothing under here is oily, so I'd like to keep it that way. I guess where the transmission meets the motor, I do see some oil, unfortunately, but that's from leaking from above, from the oil changes and the terrible location of the oil filter. Alright, so move my drain pan out of the way and go ahead. There we go. That's snug. I'll test it out with a ratchet just to see that I'm good with it. Yeah, that's plenty. I'm not gonna mess with that. Now I'm gonna go ahead and undo the bolts for the center bearing on the drive shaft. Alright, so in order to take this out, you gotta knock out both bolts on here. There's one on this side, one on the opposite side exactly like it. Alright. One's pretty loose. Let's get the other one. Alright. I'm at a terrible angle for doing this, but if you want to be able to film it, there are compromises to be made. Okay, I can now turn this by hand. I have my drain pan over by where the drive shaft meets the transmission, and that's for a very simple reason that once this drops, some fluid is going to drain out of the tail shaft. So I'll finish taking those out, and I guess I'll get a view of the tail shaft area so you guys know what I'm talking about. Kind of just supporting the drive shaft center bearing with one hand, undoing the bolt with the other. Alright, here goes nothing. Wow, surprised not very much fluid actually came out of there. A little bit, but not like a ridiculous amount. I seem to remember it being worse for some reason. Put the bolts for the center bearings right back where they go. Again, so that I don't lose them. And I'll keep them in the same exact order that they came down. Alright, so that's down. I'll end up tugging that over to the side, and that should allow me to drop it off of the e-brake cables where it's currently hanging. Just kind of sit in there. You want to protect that input shaft, wrap it in aluminum foil or something else, but you basically don't want it hitting anything, because if it gets scratched up, it's going to be bad for sealing into the transmission tail shaft later on. Now that the drive shaft is dropped, the next thing is to go over and disconnect the speedo cable and sensors. So this is my speedo cable. If you have a mechanical speedo cable, it looks like this. If you have a later Tacoma, it's an electronic one. So it'll just be like a harness that you undo. There are some other harnesses that I need to unplug down here. Let's see if I can get you guys some decent view of that. We're now under the driver's side of the transmission. This needs to be unplugged. This is the reverse light. So just do that, wiggle it out. This is clipped onto the transmission here. You can probably, I don't know, I think I have to compress something there in order to slide that off that clip. But I may just be undoing the clip because I have this wire here. It's grounded to the transmission. So I'll just be taking that off. It'll make this a little bit easier for me. So you can see here, this is your fill plug. I'll show you guys how to do that later. The slave cylinder here definitely has to come out, and this throw out lever I may replace or paint, we'll see. But in any case, slave cylinder needs to come out. The starter directly above it needs to come out. And once I do all of that, then I can start attacking all the bolts holding on the bell housing. Remove the shifter up top, as well as going around here. It's hard to get a good view, but here we have the rear transmission mount. We'll undo that as well. And with all of that loose, then I can basically pull this transmission back and remove it. Granted, because this thing is nice and tight, even once you've removed all this stuff, it's not just going to slide back. Sometimes I have to put a screwdriver in here and pry it back a little bit, but that's okay. I've done this before and I can manage it. Keep in mind, there's like a stiffener plate that goes right here. It kind of blocks this area off so it's not, exposed. That plate, you're going to have to replace it, put it back on, right? You probably want to clean it with like some brake parts cleaner in the interim, and you don't want to lose it. Some people leave that stuff open and then they wonder why all their stuff rusts out inside, right? It's there for a reason. So looking over at the passenger side, I can go ahead and undo the speedo cable. Pretty sure I'll be able to take it out by hand unless I over tightened it last time. There we go. Alright, yeah, there we go. Pull this back and just pull this little tip. That's out. So just kind of tuck it up there, out of the way. Trying to remember the Bluetooth sensor harness connects here. I don't think it's connected to the trans, but it might not be a bad idea just to unplug this. So when trans goes down and it does pull on it in any way, it won't harm it. So I'll unplug that as well. Looking at the speedo cable, if it had been too tight to do it by hand, you could grab it with some vice grips or some of those pliers that have a little curved inside with the teeth. Grab it there on those splines and just turn that, and it would be easy enough to take out. As for the little bracket that holds the wire here and this other cable, you can take that off with a 12mm socket. So, wow, it's really on there. That's that. Just kind of undo that and get it out of the way. And now this won't be an issue when you go take the trans down. I'm wondering if that was attached at the top of the trans or not. So the slave cylinder is actually held on by two size 12 bolts here at the top. Can't see them really at this angle, but very easy to access them though. You can just feel them. Put your wrench on there, turn it. Very easy removal from this angle. You can also attack it through the wheel well. I usually just bleed it through the wheel well. Like I'll take the wheel out on the driver's side up front and do like the bleeding from there. But as far as removing it, while you're down here dealing with the other transmission things, you may as well go ahead and undo those bolts.
See if I can get on the other one. Might need an extension to reach it, but let's get the first one most of the way, and then I'll go back and do the others. What I ended up doing was just putting a smaller wrench on it, and now I can easily turn it. I think I can already just take it out by hand at this point. Even like a bolt is like getting easy to turn with the wrench, and then suddenly as you turn it by hand, like it hardens again. Here goes nothing. Should come out now. There's one. Let's get the other one. And there we go. The slave cylinder is loosed from the transmission, so I can drop the trans and not worry about that. While I'm down here, there's also 4 bolts that I can go ahead and take out pretty easily. One here, one up here, and one on the opposite side of that over in this area right here. So those should all be a 14 millimeter. Yep. Will this fit between? Yep. I gotta make sure I hold this carefully and don't strip it. There we go. Got these bolts here. Hold that little stiffener plate I mentioned earlier. Just make sure I take them out in order and don't lose them. But yeah, you'll take those 4 out. You know, that little stiffener plate should be able to come down without too much difficulty. Just make sure you keep everything in the correct orientation. And some of these bolts might actually all be the same, but I'm extremely picky about that, so I will always put the same bolt right back into the same spot where it was. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I personally recommend it. See, this bolt is already different than the first bolt I took out. I'll do the other 2 and then I'll show you guys the starter. So these are the 4 bolts that came out of the bottom of the transmission that go to that stiffener plate. So you can see I've labeled them where they go on my Haynes manual, and I've put tape on them and labeled them. That way I can easily keep track of which bolts go where. Realistically speaking, these 3 are the same bolt, and only this middle one is different length. And you can actually see based on where it goes, right, you can tell that these would all be shorter bolts and this one would have to be longer because of the gap here, right? But still, I like I said, like putting them right back exactly where they came out of. I like keeping everything organized and, you know, avoid confusion. So that's the reason that I have all of these labeled. I'll also go ahead and get a Ziploc bag and put all of these in the Ziploc bag. They will be separate from the rest of the trans bolts. The starter bolts will have their own bag, and then all of that goes in one larger bag. This just guarantees that I don't lose any screws, because the absolute worst feeling, especially in something like a transmission, is putting it back together and you having leftover screws or a missing screw. Now, before getting started on any major job like this, it's usually a good idea, and the manual tells you to go ahead and disconnect the negative of your battery. This becomes particularly important here because we'll be removing the starter. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that now. These are size 10 millimeter on the Tacoma. So just get out a 10 mil, loosen this up slightly. Should come out without too much drama. I'll go ahead and just completely disconnect the battery. So looking down the engine bay and the driver's side, you can see the top bolt that holds the starter. You can get that from the engine bay. The lower one, you got to get it down by the wheel well. It's a little difficult to get at, but basically you're just going to stick your wrench down there with your arm and just crank on that one, take it out. Then go around, get the lower one, and you can pull the starter out of place. I recommend you disconnect the electrical harness, and it should be a pretty straightforward process. Alright, so if I zoom out of here, come back, you can see where I'm going in through, right? This is the intake manifold. So right down that way, you'll see the top of the bell housing and you'll see where the starter is. If you struggle to get that upper bolt through the engine bay, another approach is to go in through the wheel well. You'll have to remove the rubber liner that sits inside the wheel well in order to see it, but you can see the starter from there, and that's not a bad way to go about it as well. I'm going to get the lower bolt from the bottom, as I said, but if I struggle getting the upper bolt from the top, I'll come in through this wheel well and get it done. That right there is the lower starter bolt. I was able to do it from the bottom. I needed to have a slight extension on there. It's right here inside this bracket. Hard to see, but at this point I can almost touch my hand. Probably going to need a little bit more. Alright, so the lower starter bolt is out, and I can actually see the upper one here. I'm going to try to reach it, and again, it doesn't pan out the wheel well. I'm just being lazy about climbing out from under here. This is the view through the wheel well. If I reach in here, you can see that bolt is right here where my fingertip is. It's kind of hard to see with all this junk in the way, but basically right here, see my finger moving. That's the bolt you want to take out. At that point, you can back the starter up. The only other consideration is there is a harness connection on the back of that, but I'll show you. Actually, you need to do that before I take out the screw, otherwise it's going to be difficult. So you see here we have one electrical harness that you can just unplug, and the other one here you kind of pop this and there's a nut that you take out and this will slide off. I'm going to knock that out now so that then I can do the upper starter bolt and it'll be a little bit easier to deal with. If you look at the starter from the bottom, this is what I was talking about. See I do that, there's a nut in there. Gotta undo that. I already undid the harness. You just squeeze here and pull back, and that's that. I just need to undo that a little bit. See what size bolt it is, I'll tell you right now. Alright, so it looks like that's a size 12, and I'm actually accessing it through the wheel well. That's loose. I'll finish taking it out by hand. Now I'm at the back of the transmission. I've got the starter out, right? So the front is pretty much ready to roll. Now I'm going to take out this rear transmission mount. So there's 4 bolts under here. There's 4 bolts here that actually hold the transmission itself to the mount. I'm going to take out all of them. The reason being this is going to be in the way when it's time for me to start undoing, pulling the transmission back. So the first thing I'm going to do is the one transmission mount, and then mount to cross member, and I'll go from there. Now, as far as bolts go, the lowers will be 12s, the uppers will be 14. You gotta have the right size 14 so it fits in that little gap here. It's kind of annoying, but not the end of the world. Unfortunately, it's borderline impossible for me to do this and film as well. The steps are kind of difficult since I'm working on my own, but you'll now know exactly where the bolts are and what you need to do in order to get it out. Again, this is the tail shaft in the transmission. The rear end of it where it meets the drive shaft. This is the cross member. It's a frame on both sides, and then bolts the transmission. So at this point I'm done with the transmission mount bolts for the most part, at least the 8 bolts that I showed you guys earlier. There's 2 more bolts that hold that mount also to the cross member. Those go basically parallel with the frame. I need to remove those still. I haven't done it yet because I'm going to wait till I'm about to drop the transmission in order to do that. For right now though, before I can even get there, I need to go ahead and remove the shifter as this attaches directly to the transmission. Those 4 bolts that attach the transmission mount to the transmission itself are absolutely a nightmare to take out. It was way more work than I anticipated. I'd forgotten that it was that difficult to do. Like, I almost questioned why they did it that way. The mount is kind of in the way of the bolts, so as you're trying to undo them, your socket gets stuck, I think when I have this down, I'm gonna grind it, so in the future I can just put a socket through there, because I ended up having to put a flat wrench and turn them little by little, and those bolts are decently long, so I was there for a long while just senselessly turning that mess. This part should be fairly easy. If you saw my short shifter installation video, before I even do the base of this, let me take the shift knob out. The screws off counterclockwise. I have my factory shift knob on right now because my other one I'm redoing the leather wrap on. There's some Phillips head screws kind of hidden under here. So you want to like mess with the carpet at the base of this thing and just shift it around till you can feel the screws and take them out one by one. Alright, 2, and obviously the other 2 will be more toward the front. These are actually kind of easy to see. At least that one was. There's the last one. Okay, with that done, you can actually pull up this boot and kind of work it over the shifter. And you can't really get the boot off all the way without probably damaging something, if I remember correctly. So at this point, proper neutral. And down here, you're not gonna see it too well just because the way my lighting and all is set up, but if you watch my short shift video, you'll see there's a little rubber ring here, kind of around the transmission. You kind of just pop it up, and then there's a metal ring that you push down, turn counterclockwise. It's a retaining ring. Pop out, you can take this whole thing. So that's what I turned counterclockwise. Basically, I pushed it down to press the spring so I could turn it counterclockwise and get it off the pins that retain it. So that's now off, and there is a shift bushing in here. You just pull up like this and it comes out. So these parts are gonna get to sit in the truck basically until I'm done with my transmission, my clutch swap. But that's the whole of that part. I'm now wondering if it's going to be a bit of a headache to pull this out with the short shifter on. I did have a short shifter on at the time that I did my clutch last time. However, it was a different short shifter, and the spacer plate that kind of raises this up was in fact a little bit thinner. I don't know if it's going to be a huge influence, but I'll go ahead and try to drop the trans without removing that, and if it becomes a headache, then I guess I gotta try to remove that. Hopefully not, because those are Allen head bolts, and as I remember it, to get the last 2 I have to go from underneath, and it was a bit of a headache. So I'd much rather just be able to drop the transmission. Although, one thing to be said is, if you are willing to remove this piece, it will make dropping the transmission way easier, because with this piece in place, when I back the transmission up, I have to turn it, like rotate it, so that this will come out of here and I can actually drop the transmission. If you remove this so that this is not sticking out and crashing into the tunnel, the transmission should just slide back and come down in a very easy way. And man, the more I talk about it, the more attractive it seems. So I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm going to end up doing that. But we'll see. I'll make an attempt first to remove the trans, and if it becomes a headache, I guess I'll take it off. So here's an image of the bell housing. I've already done the bottom screws, right? now I need to get T1, T2, and T3. I've also gotten the starter bolts out, right? So I need to get this one that sits directly below where the starter was. Then I need to get these two that are up top, closer to the passenger side or clockwise away from the starter. So I'm probably going to access these two from the very top, and this one I will attempt to access through the wheel well. Alright, so looking in through the wheel well, I'm reaching under here, and I see the bolt that was under the starter bolts that I got to take out. It's right here. I don't think this is a 14 like those were. This looks bigger. Almost certain it's bigger. Yeah, that's probably like a 17 mil. Yep, 17 millimeter. These go to 53 foot. Okay, I'm gonna need an extension in order to get a hold of it. This is probably not the most favorable angle. Nope, I didn't need a breaker bar. Ah, what do you know? I was able to break it loose with one hand. Well, it's 53 foot-pounds, so not exactly monster torque either. Alright, so that's coming loose. See it right there. I'm gonna come around the bottom and get that. That'll probably be the easiest of these screws to get to, because the other two you gotta go through the top, and I don't foresee them being fun to get. Alright, one's out, two more to go. Alright, so here are the upper bolts for the transmission that I mentioned. You can see that bolt head just past this pipe right there. That's one of them. Then I'm trying to see if I can get you guys a shot of the other one. You can just kind of see at the end where that curve, where this pipe. So here where you see this pipe meets the block, you can kind of see in the little peak, there's another, what looks like another bolt head. That is in fact the other bolt that I have to get to. So I'm probably going to have to use a long bar, and I'm definitely, because the truck is up on ramps and jack stands right now, I'm going to have to stand on something in order to be able to reach that. Short socket for this. Let's see if I can find a short 17 that I can work with. Something. No, it fits. And if it fits, it ships. So I was able to get that screw over by the passenger side. Basically what I did was I used a longer ratchet just to break it, and then a short ratchet in order to be able to spin the ratchet in there. You have to be able to get out that bolt. They're fairly long, have a lot of threaded engagement, so you got to turn the ratchet quite a bit, and it would have really sucked to just have to keep repositioning that long one and keep doing it. So I got a short one down there and did it. That leaves me with just this one bolt. It's crazy that it almost looks roomy, but it's actually not. It's actually a few hoses and nonsense in the way that make it senselessly difficult to get down to that bolt. I'm going to try the same approach. I'm pretty sure that's what I did last time, using a long one just to break it and a short one to go through. Hopefully there I might even be able to get a deeper socket, but we'll see. I checked out my old build thread for this truck in the forums, and I realized that I'd actually done the clutch and flywheel in the past before I ever got around to doing a short shifter. That means that this was already difficult enough to take off without a short shifter being in place, and with this even thicker one, that means it's going to be even more difficult to get this trans out of here. And honestly, if I can avoid having to turn it, that's even better because it'll come out that much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and undo these bolts and take off this neck. I'll have to reseal everything afterward. with silicone, but whatever, that's the price you gotta pay to make life a lot easier and safer down there. It is what it is. So gonna go ahead and set up a wrench and start taking that out. Now, as I mentioned previously, this is a little bit tricky. The primary reason being that there's only 4 bolts you can actually get from up here. Then the last 2 bolts are over back here somewhere. You have to go from underneath the truck in order to do it. And fitment in there is extremely tight. I seem to remember that I was just barely able to get one of these in there. Then I had to turn this with a flat wrench in order to make it happen. Okay, so that one is too small. Looks like it's the next size up. Might be 2 sizes up. As a matter of fact, let's try a 7. It's too big, so it is a 6. Alright, a 6 is perfect. Metric, 6 mil. Alright, so let's go ahead, toss on some gloves because this is going to get greasy and messy before long. An extension will help here. Just make this so much easier to deal with. And here goes nothing. Okay, that one's loose. That one's loose. This one. That's loose. And then this one. This wrench is on its way out, man. I've abused it way too many times for way too many years. I'll have to find a replacement for it soon. But okay, these are loose. Now the last part where I'm gonna go underneath the truck and literally basically this is gonna go in here. I'm gonna be under there with a little flat wrench just grabbing this and just turning it, and it's gonna take a while and there's really no way to get a good video of that. So if you can imagine, just another set of these bolts just back behind where you can't see through the opening and you really can't get a tool on. So that's what you have to do. So, I was wrong. Last time, I wouldn't have been able to get you guys a good view of this. However, this time around, because the drive shaft is not in the way, you can actually see the last 2 bolts here and here. I've already got the Allen socket in that. As you can see, can't fit a wrench between this and the top of the transmission housing, or bottom as it were in this case. But, take a 1/4 inch flat wrench, grab this here, and turn it. Oh, that hurt my finger. Yeah, that's actually how I tightened those last time. The torque for these bolts is not that high, so you can actually pretty much do it like this. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, I'll be loosening this as much as I can with the wrench. Then I've got to actually take this out or I won't be able to get it past, you know, the here, and I'll have to turn the bolt by hand. I can already actually kind of do that. But that is how you get the last 2 bolts for that. I really wish they had used, instead of an Allen bolt, a standard hex head bolt, just because it would have made this task a little bit easier to deal with. But oh well. There it is. I'll do the other one and we're good to go. With those screws undone, all you really need to do is just grab this and pull it out. The spacer for the short shifter gets siliconed onto this upper part, and then down there you'll have that rubber gasket. You'll want to take that off as well.
that doesn't get sealed to anything. It just does its job by being rubbery and squishy. Oops, there were some little things on this that fell when I did that. I will definitely have to get those. I really hope they didn't fall in the transmission. That would be bad. I thought they were captured inside that thing. So at this point, all that's left to do is to remove the transmission from the vehicle. Now, you'll note that the Tacoma's rear transmission crossmember is welded to the frame. It does not come off. So all I'm going to do here is take off these last two bolts for this transmission mount on back. Then I'll go over by where the bell housing meets the engine. I will pry on that lightly with a screwdriver because it's not just going to slide back, right? That will allow me to pull that back, and I will be underneath that bell housing section supporting it in a very awkward and uncomfortable bench pressing position, and slowly guide that down onto like my stomach, right, with the help of a friend. And then once we get up from under it and that's on the floor, we're going to push the transmission toward the front of the vehicle in the direction of the engine so that we can get the back of the transmission off of that mount. Then we'll also guide that down slowly. Now, it's going to be very difficult to try to get video of that for you guys simply because there's going to be two people under here doing that. But we'll see what I can do. I'll probably put the tripod and set the camera up on the other side, and whatever we can get, we will get for you. So I wasn't able to get it on film, unfortunately, but we were able to get the transmission down. Really what we did was we took the transmission mount and the back off, right? That let the tail shaft of the transmission kind of freewheel. Then we started prying between the bell housing and the motor using a flathead screwdriver. And we were struggling a lot. It would go off on one side, wouldn't on the other. And then I realized that I forgot something very, very simple, and that's the exhaust bracket. It goes from the exhaust manifold onto the transmission. I'd undone the bolts, but I hadn't physically removed it, and it holds on to that exhaust manifold pretty well. So with that in place, it was very difficult for us to move the transmission. Obviously impossible because it stops it. It's basically holding it, right, pushing against it. So once we took that off, we kept prying, and like transmission slid off the pins. We brought it back, slowly lowered the front, the bell housing down onto the ground. As we did that, we realized we still had to turn it in order to have enough room to back the tail shaft off of the crossmember. But once we did that, it came right down, and I slid it out of the front. It was real easy to do. It's not that heavy. I may have actually been able to bring it down by myself. I guess I remembered it being heavier because I did do this when I was a scrawny 155-pound college kid the first time. At 190 pounds now, it did not seem that impressive. So if you're a larger individual, might not be a big deal. Otherwise, you might want a friend to help you. Either way, it's nice to just have someone help you guide it down slowly and control it, because you're in an angle where it's difficult to generate a ton of force. So, you know, your mileage may vary. It depends obviously on your own size, strength, and the length of your limbs and all that. But
overall, that's the process, and just make sure you get that exhaust manifold bracket out, and it shouldn't be that difficult to do. If you've enjoyed this video, if you want to see more like it, want to follow up and see the clutch video that's coming up afterward, feel free to like, subscribe, and click that notification bell so that you're notified when I post up another video. If you have any feedback on how I can improve this or just general commentary, feel free to leave that in the comment section. And as always, thank you guys for watching.